All right, now in the second section of this episode, I'm going to start dealing with a topic that I've been thinking about and going over in my mind for a while now, is the deal with diversity, multiculturalism, race, ethnicity, tradition, heritage, and pretty much any other word related to those words. And I have some definitions here from different websites. I'm going to start with this definition for diversity. And here, Noah Webster, the original Webster's dictionary before they ruined the dictionary with the Merriam-Webster dictionary. This is the original Webster's dictionary. And they define diversity as difference, dissimilitude, unlikeness. There may be diversity without contrariety. There is great diversity in human constitutions. Okay, so that's just the basic meaning of diversity, which is that there are differences. There are unlikenesses or dislikenesses among humans. Okay, humans are different. Nothing wrong with that. That's biblical, so no problems there. I think God, as creator, derives glory from the diversity of his creation in terms of how different humans are made and the different locations on earth, how different they are, and the different, plant life, animal life, and just the differences all around the world. I think God made it like that on purpose for his glory and to, show everyone that he is the creator. Okay, so nothing wrong with that. Second definition here is race. So they define race as the lineage of a family or a continued series of descendants from a parent who was called the stock. A race is the series of descendants indefinitely, thus all mankind are called the race of Adam. The Israelites are the race of Abraham and Jacob. Thus we speak of a race of kings, the race of Clovis or Charlemagne, a race of nobles. A generation, family of descendants, a race of youthful and unhandled colts. Number 3, a particular breed, as a race of mules, a race of horses, a race of sheep. So basically, it's a certain kind or a certain type of human or people groups, I guess if you want to say. Basically, it's a certain kind of human. And of course, that's a part of the diversity of humanity that we have. We're created in different races. We're all of different descent. We have different ancestors, if you want to use that term as well. And we all look different. So, of course, our race has an effect on how we look and some of the virtues that we hold, which leads to the traditions that each race and each culture has. But as we get into the cultures of different people, we have to deal with two different things, and one of them is the idea of assimilation and integration, and the other idea is multiculturalism. So the first idea, dealing with different cultures, is assimilation. So when one person of one culture goes into another country or another nation that's of a different culture, and by culture I mean the set of beliefs, values, virtues, traditions, and the practices. Each race has a different practice depending on where you are in the world. And so when one person comes to a different place that has a different set of practices and has an overall different culture, there's two things you can do. One is you can fit in, or you can assimilate or integrate. You can become one with the nation that you're in. And so here they define assimilation as to absorb into the cultural tradition of a population or group. So of course, if you're going to be among people who are not like you, you have to understand how they talk and how they think, the traditions that they hold and the values that they hold. And you can choose to become familiar with how they operate so you can work with them, or you can become familiar with how they operate so you can become one of them. So that's kind of the two options there with assimilation. You can just have a knowledge of how the nation operates and how the people think and what they hold as virtues and their traditions and their practices, their beliefs. Or you can learn all that and become one of them and you do the same practices that they have and have the same beliefs and virtues that they have. And same thing with when integrate, you become united with the nation that you are moving to. If you're a foreigner moving to another nation and you assimilate, you integrate yourself into that nation, you become one, you become united with that nation. And then we also have this idea of multiculturalism, which has been predominantly been growing in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom as well, in certain liberal spheres, especially with education and sociology, things like that. And basically the idea of multiculturalism is the view that cultures, races, and ethnicities, particularly those of minority groups, deserve special acknowledgement of their differences within a dominant political culture. So, instead of assimilating or integrating, the foreigner now goes into a foreign nation and they tell everyone, hey, you got to respect my culture and you have to validate my practices, my beliefs, what I uphold as virtues, and things like that. So, now the way that plays out is that you have different communities, especially in a place like the United States. You have different communities in all over the United States and various locations where you have little tiny pockets of a different culture that's not an American culture. This also brings into question, what is American culture? Because America has largely become a melting pot. Another definition that I have here, a place where a variety of people's cultures or individuals assimilate into a cohesive whole. Well, that isn't always the case. Again, when you have the idea of multiculturalism, the minority cultures stick out a lot more than the majority cultures. But when you have multiculturalism, the minority groups demand to be represented more than the majority groups because the minority groups feel left out. Now, what happens is that not all cultures, not all practices, not all traditions, and what different nations hold as virtues and vices, positives and negatives, it's different. It varies from culture to culture, from person to person, from nation to nation. Every nation is different. Every culture is different. And to a certain extent, I think God derives glory from the differences in our cultures and nations because there's a variety of ways that we express ourselves and how Christians express themselves and express their gratitude to God. I think there's a variety of ways that can be done. But then again, there's another side to every nation. There's a bad side to every nation and culture with things like pagan traditions, pagan worship, and anything related to that as well. So it's always important to understand that every culture has a good side and a bad side. It has a godly side and an anti-godly side, or at least it has a side that can be used as godly. But again, when you're trying to mix all the cultures together, when you're trying to mix all the cultures together and you put in this idea of multiculturalism, you get the minority cultures being pushed above the other cultures. And then there's some problems with that. One of the problems is that there is a form of racism that comes out of this, which is that they're trying to, as they're lifting up the minority culture, they're pushing down the majority cultures. So in America, the United States, the majority of people living here are white. The minorities are, of course, Mexicans, African Americans, or just Black Americans, Asian, and all sorts of groups are quote unquote represented here in the United States. But the majority is white. Now, as you have these, let's take the actual Africans who came from Africa and who have come over here, and now they're trying to spread their culture, share their culture. But what ends up happening is that they push down the other cultures around them. And this is a form of racism, in my opinion, because they are saying that one culture is superior over the other. So what's been happening in the past, I'd say 10 years, a little bit before that even, is that we've had white people being demonized and being used as a basically white people have been on the receiving end of a lot of, I'll say, mockery and shame. Basically, and again, that's because they're trying to uplift these other minority cultures above the majority, and the majority is white, so they're going to have to push down the white people. They're going to have to knock them down a peg so that the minorities can rise above them. And again, they're doing that because they think that the white people are inferior. And a lot of things play into this. One of the things is, of course, with the perceived white colonialism. That's one of the terms that's been thrown around. The white people are the most racist to all the minorities, and that white people are, the root of all evil, in a sense. They started slavery. They slaughtered Native Americans. They enslaved the blacks, and they push everyone else down in their pursuit of coming out on top. And that whole idea, so there's been a reaction from the minorities to that, or at least that's what they perceive. And so then they start demonizing the white person, and then you have all these movies coming out which have that in the news and the media. And then you also have books and education. They teach that the white man is bad, the white man is the devil, things like that. And again, this is all happening in the name of multiculturalism. And one of the things that they've been telling white people, especially in universities, is that they need to remove their whiteness, remove themselves from their whiteness, and start embracing other cultures and other ethnicities. And again, just another definition to keep us on track: ethnic, of or relating to a large group, to large groups of people classed according to common racial, national, tribal, religious, linguistic, or cultural origin or background. Again, you're dealing with these different peoples groups. They have a different set of beliefs. They have a different set of virtues, and they believe different things about everything. There's a complete difference between different cultures. Of course, they're different cultures, so they're going to have a different set of beliefs and practices. They also have this idea of nationality, which is national status, legal relationship involving allegiance on the part of an individual and usually protection on the part of the state. So that basically legally you are part of a certain nation. A people having a common origin, tradition, and language, and capable of forming or actually constituting a nation state. Okay, that's a little bit of a different definition. Loyalty and devotion to a nation. That's what it means in the political sense. Nationalism is that you're devoted to the particular nation that you're from. But really, how this all plays together, again, when you take into account diversity, multiculturalism, that we're trying to represent some of the less represented groups. Basically, in my opinion, what they're trying to do is they're trying to put a square peg in a round hole. They're trying to do something that's not going to work, because imagine if you had a bunch of white people go over to Africa and they said, okay, now white people are the minority in Africa, and now you have to adopt, or you have to appreciate and validate our culture and our forms of expression. That's not going to fly. They're not going to allow that. There's going to be a lot of retaliation against that, probably all over the world. But that's what America is expected to do. And there's more than one group that's coming over to America and saying, you have to understand us. You have to give us a voice. And we have to see ourselves in your media, in your TV shows, in your movies, in your books. And you have to teach, you have to educate your people in a way that makes the minorities look good and the majority look bad. Well, it's not going to work because that's going to create white people who retaliate against that, and then we're going to have some problems in the future. And there's a common theory that's being thrown around that we're going to have a race war in the future. Even Charles Manson talked about that. He called it Helter Skelter, which is after a Beatles song, and he said that there's going to be a race war between whites and blacks. I don't think it's as simple as the way Charles Manson portrayed it, but I think there will be something like a race war, and I think that's going to be a part of, a couple of different things that are going to happen in the future. I think there's a lot of bad things that are going to happen coming up here in the next 10 years probably, and I think some kind of race war is probably a part of that. I'm not sure entirely how it's going to play out, but there's definitely going to be something, because we can see the seeds of it growing now, where you have this minority groups. The minority groups are hating the majority group. Whites, all the minorities are hating the whites, and it's being started. The seeds have been planted, especially in the younger generations who are being taught these things. Even with genders, there's going to be a gender war in the future probably, and it's not going to be like men versus women. It's going to be, normal people versus the not normal people. The people who believe that gender is absolute and that there's only two genders defined biblically by God, and there's going to be the other side who believe in this weird amorphous gender, where gender's not even really a real thing anymore, and you can decide whatever gender you are, and it's all valid. There might be something like that. And again, when I'm using the word war, I don't mean it's going to be like a fist fight, or it's going to be with guns. I think it's going to be a different kind of war. There's already a culture war that's started. There's already a political war that's been going on for a long time between Republicans and Democrats, right and left. And it's not a war with fists or with guns. It's a war with words. It's a war with ideas, with legislation, with laws. Especially with this whole COVID thing, the pandemic. That was a kind of war on those who don't listen. It was a war between those who listen well and those who don't listen well, and those who don't listen to the government. So it's basically the obedient versus the disobedient. That was the war, and they turned the people on each other. So they've shown that it's possible to turn people on each other. So it's not that far-fetched to think that they can do that with gender or with race. And they've already done those things to a certain extent. So, again, the minority groups, they're no longer willing to assimilate, although a large portion of them have. I think if you interview any sort of minority on the street, I think 8 times out of 10, they're probably going to say, yeah, they don't really care about their own culture anyways, so they're just going to adopt the culture of America because they grew up here. But then you have the people who are really liberal-minded and who, they went to a liberal university, they have a degree in some sort of social subject or something. Then they're going to be the ones saying that the minority groups have to have their spotlight. But just to make this clear, I'm not saying we can appreciate other cultures. I've already said that I think God has allowed differences in our cultures and in the way that each nation does things and the different practices and things like that. God has allowed that. I think God derives glory from that in the different ways that we can express our gratitude to God and the different ways that we can worship God. And I mean God, the God of the Bible, the true God. I don't mean like the way that Muslims worship Allah is just as valid as the way that Christians worship God in the biblical sense. Those are two completely different ideas. One of them is wrong, the other one's right. And those two ideas cannot be assimilated and they cannot be integrated. And Christians cannot accept that they are brothers or fellow believers with Muslims or with Buddhists or with Roman Catholics to a certain extent. So there are some problems with that, and that also goes into the whole thing about the coexist, and we can all coexist and we're all just worshiping the same God with different words and different practices. No, that's not true. There, again, as I said before, there is a part of every culture. There's a good and a bad side. There was a godly side and an ungodly side. You have to cut off that ungodly side before you can start to please God or become Christ-like with your culture. So, for example, things like music, that's totally fine. There's different music within cultures. I even like music from around the world, all different sorts of cultures and nations. I don't have a problem with that. That's cool. If you want to listen to music from, Brazilian folk, that's fine. You want to listen to classic Asian music, that's also fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with looking at, researching, studying how other cultures do things and how they, the kind of music that they have. And even, like how, when they have dinner, how they have dinner, what kind of foods they eat. There's nothing wrong about that. How they dress, the kind of virtues they have, the kind of negatives, what they view as negative. There's nothing wrong in adopting some of those things and learning learning those things. But it does become a problem when, for example, you start to adopt the the Chinese view of God. You get into Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism. That's anti-biblical, anti-God, so it's ungodly. So it's not wise to adopt those practices. And for example, also the Asian view of their ancestors. Each home, they have an altar to their deceased ancestors, and they offer sacrifices to it and burn incense in remembrance of their ancestors. That's ungodly. That's not biblical. Again, you cannot adopt those things because they are just not biblical. So, there are some practices that are, I think, are interesting, and you can study them, and to a certain extent, you can adopt some of them. Like, for example, you can have tea, like the Chinese do. You can have, or tea like the British do. That doesn't have a negative moral effect. But it's when you get into the pagan practices, that's what has a negative moral effect. And those are the things you have to stay away from. And that's the downside of this multiculturalism. And again, multiculturalism does become a form of racism, because as you're raising up the minority, you're pushing down the majority, which is a form of racism. Well, some people say, well, you can't be racist because racism is when the majority is against the minority. That's not true. As we'll see here, I'll look up the definition of racist, or actually, racism would be better. And they say a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So it's not about majority or minority. It's about whether you uphold your culture and your race and your traditions over other cultures, traditions, and races. So, what does this mean for Christians? Well, everything I just said applies to Christians in one way or another. But more clearly, what does the Bible say about race? Well, of course, we have the popular passage from Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So what does this mean? Does this mean that as Christians we are raceless? We are neither slave nor free? And we are genderless? We are raceless and genderless? No, that's not what this verse is saying. What this verse is saying is that God is, well, the next verse actually touches on that. God shows no partiality. Therefore, we show no partiality. We shouldn't be treating people different based on their race or whether they're slave or free, whether they're male or female. We should not be treating one harshly and the other more softly. Although to a certain extent that does play a role in how males treat females, how females treat males, things like that. There is obviously a difference in how the genders treat each other. But we don't give anyone the short end of the stick. You don't treat females as like they are less than you if you're a male. You don't treat Jews shouldn't treat Greeks like Greeks are less than them. Whites shouldn't treat blacks like they're less than them. Blacks shouldn't treat whites like they're less than them. Sitting with slave or free. Free people should not be treating slaves like they are less than them. Slaves should not be treating free people like they are less than them. Because if you are saved in Christ Jesus, those things don't matter. And so they have no bearing on how you treat one another. And because God doesn't regard anybody according to these things, he doesn't regard anyone as male or female when he's judging them or when he's saving them. And neither race or slave nor free. So that's why we shouldn't really be holding on to these things and lording them over people, saying that my race, my culture is better than yours, or your race, your culture is better than mine. So I think that's how this applies to this issue. And also with Acts 17:26, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of the dwelling place. It's talking about how God structured the earth with a particular intention, that, this wasn't all due to random chance or a random accident, but God devised the world to be in a particular way. And Romans 10, verses 12 through 13, for there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all. So again, what I was just explaining with the Galatians verse, bestowing his riches on all who call on him, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But if you show partiality, this is from James chapter 2, verse 9, but if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. So again, if you show partiality based on race, gender, or slave and free, that is a sin. And if you're if you're treating negatively or treating more positive any person from a different race, that's a sin because you're treating someone different than what they deserve. Everyone deserves to be treated with the same measure and the same ruler, and the law applies to everyone the same, and God saves everyone the same. It's not different depending on what race you are or what gender you are. And again, in regards to nationalism, in regards to where we're born and how we should carry that, we can't deny that we're born in different places, right? We have, depending on what state you're born in the United States, you have a different accent. You can't deny where you come from, and I think to a certain extent you can be proud of where you're from. I'm still struggling with defining pride apart from sinful pride. Is all pride sinful? That's kind of the question that I've been dealing with in my mind for a while, because I do feel a sense of pride for being born in America, the United States. I do feel a sense of pride for this nation and for the culture, the American culture. And if you want to call it the white culture, I have adopted the white culture. So, that's kind of the way I see it. But again, as Christians, we are sojourners in the world. We're not going to stay in the world forever. And as it says in Philippians chapter 3, verse 20, our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. So it's referring to the fact we're waiting for Christ to take us home to heaven with him. And that's our real nationality. So it's silly to think that a Christian can go around and I'm not saying Christians are doing this. I think Christians are probably the least likely to do this. But Christians can't walk around saying that their nation, that the nation that they came from, has the best, and that all the other nations and cultures are below them. There's no reason that a Christian should be going around talking like that. But again, I think we can have maybe a little pride. Again, I'm not sure how that all works out, but I think we can be thankful to where God has placed us and the kind of people, the kind of race that God has made us in. And we should never look down on how God has made us and where God has placed us, because ultimately that's rebelling against God, and that's a sin. So if you're born with a particular skin color, if you're born in a particular place of the world and you don't like it, that's in rebellion against how God has made you. And if you think you're the wrong gender, again, that's in rebellion to what God has made you. You should not mess with how God has made you, and you should not look down on how God has made you and where He has placed you. Because again, that's God's decision, not yours, and He is sovereign and He is glorified. And no matter what circumstance you were born in. Again, that's not to say, like if you're born with a disease and, you say, well, I guess I'm stuck with this disease forever because that's how God made me. No, if you have a disease, get that fixed, do what you can to preserve your life. That's another important thing. I think preserve your life and sustain life, cherish life. And I think those are obviously rare occurrences, and we shouldn't be judging everything based on the rare occurrences. We shouldn't be applying how we treat rare occurrences to the majority of occurrences. So for the most part, you should not want to change how God has made you, because He has made you with a particular purpose, with an intention. You weren't randomly placed here, and God has made you the way He has for a particular purpose. And if you rebel against that purpose, if you rebel against the way that God has made you, you are rebelling against God, and that is a sin. So, to summarize, multiculturalism is wrong. Again, also this plays into intersectionality and all these sorts of things, identity politics, all these kinds of things that are coming out of leftist education. And it's wrong because it teaches people to not appreciate where they come from, and instead you have to demonize where you come from and appreciate someone else's, another minority's culture. We can appreciate all cultures, but it should not be forced on you to appreciate someone else's culture. It shouldn't be forced on you, this idea that your culture is not as good as someone else's, or that your skin color is not as good as someone else's. It shouldn't be forced on you, and you shouldn't come to that conclusion anyway. So in multiculturalism, they're forcing you to appreciate the cultures of the minorities and to hold them over your own, or to hold them over the white man's culture. And that's wrong. That's a sin, because again, you're showing partiality based on culture and race and ethnicity. That's a sin. That's real racism. A lot of people throw the word racist around now, but that's real racism. 9 times out of 10, when someone calls someone a racist, they're wrong. But I think this is the real racism that's been happening for a while. So, again, appreciate your own culture and where you come from. Appreciate your nation, and give thanks to God for who He has made you, and for your gender that you're born with, the race that you're born with, the place that you're born in. Give thanks to God for that. And don't try to uplift yourself to the detriment of others around you. And in other words, don't hold on to your nation, don't hold on to your culture or your tradition in such a way that makes you feel superior over other people. Because that's a sin, again, showing partiality because of ethnicity and because of race, because of culture. That is a sin. Okay, well, that was kind of longer than I expected. And again, I've been holding in this information for a while now. I'm hoping that was interesting and helpful to you, the listeners. I appreciate any feedback, any questions, any problems you had with my explanations. Please let me know. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Mark the Mimic. Both places I have the same name. Ask me questions. And I hope you enjoyed this. And I'll see you in the next episode.
Listen, I am not nice, I am not kind, and I am not wonderful.